David had always believed in the sanctity of his relationship. At 34, he had been with his fiancée Sophia for almost 5 years, and they had been talking about taking the next step: marriage. They had a beautiful apartment in downtown Chicago, both held solid jobs, and everything seemed picture perfect. They were the envy of their friends. But all that changed on a random Saturday afternoon when David decided to clean out a storage unit that had become a dumping ground for everything they didn't need. While sifting through old boxes, he came across an old USB drive buried under a pile of forgotten memorabilia. Out of curiosity, he plugged it into his laptop. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary: old videos of vacations, photos from their early years together. But then, he found a folder titled Bachelorette Party. David wasn't one to snoop through his fiancée's private things, but he thought this would be harmless: just a glimpse of Sophia's wild bachelorette party. What he discovered instead was nothing short of devastating. The first video appeared normal. Sophia and her friends were enjoying shots and laughing together. Then, the second video made his blood run cold. It showed Sophia at a club, her arms wrapped around a man who was dressed as a fireman stripper. The camera zoomed in as Sophia kissed him passionately. In that moment, everything David thought he knew about their relationship came crashing down. When Sophia came home, David confronted her immediately, holding up the video on his phone. Her reaction was cold, casual, almost as if he had just asked about an old movie they watched. She shrugged it off, trying to make excuses, claiming it was just a fun night, and before they were even engaged. But for David, it wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was a betrayal that was not only physical, but emotional. She had kept this secret from him for years. Sophia dismissed his concerns, telling him he was overreacting and making a big deal out of nothing. David's trust shattered, and he walked out, needing space to process the truth. Later, in an attempt to fix things, Sophia suggested marriage counseling. At first, David agreed, hoping that maybe they could salvage their relationship, but he quickly realized that Sophia was doing it for all the wrong reasons. During their therapy sessions, she was dismissive, minimizing the gravity of the situation. She laughed off his pain and refused to show any real remorse. David couldn't understand how someone he had trusted so deeply could dismiss his feelings so easily. His doubts about their relationship grew stronger every day. She would go out late, sometimes without giving him any explanation. When he asked about it, she always had an excuse, but something didn't feel right. Sophia was too busy playing the perfect image on social media, while David was left to question everything about their life together. The final blow came when David learned that Sophia was pregnant. At first, he tried to stay supportive, hoping it would bring them closer. But the timing felt off. Their relationship had been falling apart for months, and now he couldn't help but wonder if the baby was really his. David decided to wait for the baby to be born and get a paternity test. The result confirmed his worst fears. The baby wasn't his. The trust he had in Sophia was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. His world had crumbled under the weight of her lies. David knew what he had to do. He needed to leave her, even if it meant walking away from the life they had built together. After the revelation of the paternity test results, a heavy cloud of uncertainty lingered over David's mind. It was like a weight had been dropped on his chest, pressing the air out of his lungs every time he thought about what was happening. How could this be real? For 8 years, he had dedicated himself to Sophia, and now, just like that, everything was shattered. He had stood by her through everything, through her career changes, moving to different cities, and even supporting her when they went through their rough patches. But this betrayal was beyond anything he had imagined. Sophia had lied to him for months. She had allowed him to believe that the child she was carrying was his, all while she was sneaking around behind his back with another man. She had manipulated him, convinced him that they could fix their issues, that things would get better, and now she expected him to believe that they could start a family together with a baby that wasn't his. The next few days were a blur of emotions. David didn't know how to deal with the fact that he wasn't going to be a father, at least not in the way he had imagined. Every time he looked at Caleb, he was filled with this profound sadness because the baby was innocent in all of this. Caleb had no control over the mess that had been created by his mother's lies. And still, David couldn't shake the feeling that everything around him was a lie. The marriage, the baby, the future they had planned, it all felt like a house of cards waiting to collapse. Sophia, on the other hand, was still in denial. She didn't seem to understand the depth of her betrayal. Every time David tried to confront her, she deflected, offering empty apologies but never truly accepting responsibility. She told him that she made a mistake, that it was a one-night thing with a coworker she had been seeing during the hardest months of their relationship. But the more she spoke, the more David realized that this was just another attempt to manipulate him. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry that she had been caught. The tension between them grew unbearable. David couldn't look at her without feeling disgusted. Every time she touched him, kissed him, or smiled at him, all he could think about was that baby, her baby, not his. It made him sick to his stomach. The spark that had once been there between them was gone, replaced by a cold, unshakable distrust. David started distancing himself from Sophia, avoiding her as much as possible. He refused to engage in conversations about the future, about the baby, or anything that required him to pretend that everything was okay. His days were spent at work, running from the reality that was waiting for him when he came home. He couldn't bear the thought of facing her, of pretending that the life they had was still intact. Sophia, meanwhile, continued to play the victim. She would post pictures on social media, pretending that everything was perfect. She would share pictures of Caleb, acting like a proud mother, basking in the attention she was getting from her friends and family. But David could see through the facade. He knew the truth. She wasn't happy, she wasn't fulfilled, and deep down, she knew she had destroyed everything. David's mind constantly raced. Should he confront her again? Should he demand the truth from her? He had already received the truth from the paternity test, but the emotional side of him still felt empty. The idea of being a father to a child that wasn't his, knowing that it had been a result of his wife's infidelity, was eating him alive. But no matter how many times he tried to shake it off, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this was just the beginning of the end. One evening, he found himself sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone, trying to distract himself from the chaos in his life. He stumbled upon a video they had made years ago before the cracks started to show in their marriage. It was a trip they had taken together to a beach town just a few hours away. The video was full of laughter, carefree moments, and the kind of love that seemed so genuine back then. Watching it, David felt like a stranger to himself. He couldn't believe how happy they had been, how hopeful he had been. That man in the video didn't know what was about to happen to him, didn't know that the woman he loved would betray him in such a devastating way. The next day, David received a call from his best friend, Andrew. Andrew had always been there for him, from high school through college, and even when David had met Sophia, Andrew had always been the voice of reason, and right now, David needed that more than ever. David, man, I'm sorry to hear about everything. I know things are rough, but you need to start thinking about what's next. You can't stay stuck in this toxic environment. It's not good for you, and it's certainly not good for Caleb. David didn't want to hear it. He wasn't ready to face the truth. But deep down, he knew that Andrew was right. He couldn't keep living like this, could he? He couldn't pretend anymore that everything would magically fix itself. He had to make a decision. As the days passed, the situation with Sophia became increasingly unbearable. He was losing himself in the process of trying to make things work with a woman who wasn't interested in repairing the damage she had caused. She had already moved on emotionally. She was more concerned with the idea of maintaining the image of a perfect family than acknowledging the broken trust in their relationship. It wasn't long before David realized that the only way forward was to leave. The thought terrified him, but the idea of staying, of continuing to live in this lie, was even more terrifying. He couldn't sacrifice his happiness, his well-being, for a woman who had betrayed him and who still wasn't fully ready to face the consequences of her actions. Sophia's behavior grew more erratic as the days went by. She would beg him to come back, to fix things, but it was always on her terms. She demanded that he accept the child as his, even though David had every reason to believe the baby wasn't his. He couldn't believe she was still trying to manipulate him, even after everything. David reached out to a lawyer and started looking into his options. He knew he had to get out of this marriage, but the legal process was going to be another battle in itself. Sophia wasn't going to go down without a fight, and David wasn't sure he was ready for the kind of fight it would take to get out of this situation unscathed. But what really broke David was when he saw Sophia one last time, holding Caleb in her arms, her face full of false innocence, trying to convince him that everything could be fixed. She begged him to come back, to play the part of the father for Caleb's sake, but David knew better now. He had been played for too long. This was his chance to walk away for good. Weeks passed, and the unease David felt didn't subside. He had tried to go through the motions of normal life, going to work, attending social events, even meeting up with friends, yet nothing felt right. He was still haunted by the image of Caleb in his arms, a baby he had cared for with all the tenderness of a father, yet whose paternity was forever uncertain. Sophia acted as though nothing had changed. She plastered on her usual fake smile, throwing herself into the role of the perfect mother, all while David's world continued to crumble. David's suspicions began to eat away at him. The more he thought about it, the more the timeline didn't make sense. He remembered that the last time they had been intimate, it was during one of their attempts to reconnect, a cold, forced attempt to rebuild something that had long been broken. The dates just didn't align with when Caleb was conceived, and despite his best efforts to dismiss his concerns, doubt continued to gnaw at him. The tipping point came during another argument about something insignificant. He was sitting in the living room, flipping through a magazine, while Sophia went on and on about her plans for the weekend. She was excited about a dinner she was going to with some of her friends from work. As usual, she was being vague about the details. When he asked who exactly she would be meeting, she hesitated for a second and then gave him the usual response. Just the girls. David couldn't help but feel his blood boil. It wasn't even the fact that she was going out again. It was the complete lack of transparency. It was the lies, the constant evasion, the refusal to even try to make things right. "Why can't you just tell me the truth, Sophia?" David asked, his voice trembling with frustration. "Who are you really meeting?" Sophia gave him a dismissive look. "Oh, stop acting like a child, Marcus. I'm meeting friends. You act like I'm hiding something." David stood up abruptly, not willing to let the conversation slide. "You've been hiding everything. You think I'm stupid?" Sophia rolled her eyes, clearly irritated. "This is ridiculous. You're still holding on to this nonsense from months ago. Let it go." The words stung. It wasn't just the fact that she was refusing to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. It was how she was so willing to dismiss his feelings, his concerns. She had been the one to betray him, and yet she acted as though he was the one at fault. "I can't just let it go, Sophia. I trusted you. And you destroyed that trust. This isn't just about that night with the stripper. It's everything, the lies, the deceit. You've been lying to me for months, and I can't just pretend it's okay. I'm not the same person anymore." Sophia's face softened for a moment, but then her defenses came up again. "I've told you. It was a mistake. A one-night thing. It doesn't mean anything." "Doesn't mean anything?" David's voice was incredulous. "You've been lying to me for months, and you think I can just let it go? You expect me to pretend like everything is fine, but I can't. I can't live in this lie." Sophia stared at him, her eyes cold. "You're being dramatic. We've had a good life, Marcus. You're throwing it all away over something that happened years ago." David shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about something that happened years ago. This is about the betrayal, the lies, and the fact that you don't even care. You're acting like it's nothing." The argument continued into the night. David tried to leave, but he couldn't. He was trapped in his own mind, wrestling with the emotional turmoil that Sophia had caused. He couldn't leave, not yet, not while Caleb was still a part of his life. The next day, as he sat in the living room, David had an epiphany. The longer he stayed, the more it felt like he was just perpetuating a lie. The longer he tried to make things work with Sophia, the more he was losing himself. He wasn't just losing trust in her, he was losing trust in himself, in his ability to make good decisions. That's when he decided he needed to take control. He couldn't keep pretending that everything would be fine. He couldn't stay in a marriage built on lies and manipulation. It was time to confront the situation head on, no matter the consequences. David called his lawyer the next morning. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, and he knew it was going to be painful. But he couldn't live like this anymore. He couldn't continue to put his own well-being at risk for someone who didn't care about him. Sophia, meanwhile, was still living in her bubble. She was still posting pictures of Caleb on social media, still pretending that everything was fine. David watched as she paraded around with the image of the perfect family, while in reality, everything was falling apart. The next week, David moved out of the house. It was a painful process, but it was necessary. He needed space to breathe, to think, and to regain some semblance of control over his life. Sophia didn't take it well, of course. She screamed and cried, begging him to stay. But David had made up his mind. He couldn't go back to that life. David found a small apartment across town. It wasn't much, but it was his. It was quiet, and it gave him time to think. It was the first time in a long time that he didn't feel like he was suffocating under the weight of his own marriage. Sophia, on the other hand, was struggling. Her social media posts no longer garnered as many likes as before, and her friends were starting to pull away from her. It was clear that people were beginning to see through her facade. They were seeing the real her, the woman who had betrayed her husband, lied to him, and manipulated the situation to her advantage. She had no one left to blame but herself. David spent the next few weeks focusing on himself. He started going to the gym, reconnected with old friends, and started picking up hobbies he had abandoned during his marriage. It felt good to rediscover who he was outside of his relationship with Sophia. He began to heal, to find peace within himself. One day, David received a text from Sophia. It was short and to the point. "I miss you. I made a mistake. Can we talk?" David stared at the message, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to respond, wanted to hear her out. But another part of him knew that it wasn't worth it. He had tried, he had given everything, and she had taken it for granted. He took a deep breath, put the phone down, and made his decision. He wasn't going back. It was time to move on for good. Days turned into weeks, and David began to realize just how deeply his trust in Sophia had been shattered. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, on his ability to see through the facades that others put up. But this was different. His wife, the woman he had trusted with his heart and his life, had lied to him for months, and not only that, she had been living a double life. David couldn't stop thinking about the paternity test results. His mind constantly circled back to the undeniable truth. Caleb wasn't his son. The doubts that had been eating at him for so long were now confirmed, and they hit harder than he could have imagined. He didn't know how to move forward. He wanted to confront Sophia, to scream at her, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Not yet. He needed answers first. As he sat alone in his apartment, staring out the window, the weight of it all began to feel unbearable. He had tried so hard to give their marriage another chance. He had gone to therapy, trying to understand her perspective, trying to fix what was broken between them. But now he realized that he had been the only one putting in the effort. Sophia wasn't interested in fixing things. She was too busy maintaining her image of the perfect life, the perfect mother, the perfect wife. Meanwhile, David was left drowning in the mess of her lies. He reached for his phone and called his lawyer. "It's time," David said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet determination. "Let's get the divorce proceedings started." That night, he confronted Sophia. The confrontation wasn't explosive like he had imagined it would be. Instead, it was cold, calculated, and suffocating. She sat on the couch, her phone in hand, her gaze distant, as though she couldn't care less about what was happening around her. "David, what is this about now?" she asked, her voice flat, not even looking up from her phone. David felt his anger building, but he forced himself to remain calm. It's about the lies, Sophia. The lies you've been feeding me for months. About Caleb. About everything. Sophia glanced up, her eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, David said. He held up the paternity test results and showed her the cold, hard proof. This is it, Sophia. Caleb isn't mine. You lied to me. You let me believe he was mine, and you betrayed me. Sophia's face went pale as she read the results. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, as if it was nothing, she sighed deeply and stood up. I didn't think you'd find out. It was a mistake, David. It was a one-time thing. I never meant for this to happen. David's heart pounded in his chest, his hands clenched into fists. A mistake? He repeated, his voice rising. You've been lying to me for months, and now you're telling me it was a mistake? Do you even understand what this means? Sophia's face twisted with frustration. It was a mistake, David. It was one night, before we even got married. Why are you making this so complicated? David took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He had been through enough. He couldn't keep going through the motions with her anymore. He had given her the benefit of the doubt, hoping that she would realize the gravity of the situation, but she hadn't. And now he was done. I'm done, Sophia. I can't keep doing this. I can't live with someone who doesn't respect me, someone who lies to me every single day, David said, his voice heavy with finality. This marriage is over. Sophia opened her mouth to say something, but David cut her off. No, don't even try. You've made your choices, and now I'm making mine. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but David didn't flinch. He had seen her cry too many times before. The tears didn't matter anymore. They didn't change anything. They were just another tactic to manipulate him into staying. I'm leaving, Sophia, David said. I'm getting a divorce. You can keep playing the perfect wife, the perfect mother. But I'm done. With that, David turned and walked out of the apartment. As he left, he didn't look back. He couldn't. It felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, and for the first time in months, he felt free. Sophia's facade was crumbling, and David knew it. He knew that she had been living a lie, and now the truth was out. But he also knew something else. He had learned to trust himself again. He had trusted his instincts, and they hadn't let him down. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal meetings and paperwork. David's lawyer wasted no time in getting the divorce proceedings started. He didn't care about the drama that Sophia would undoubtedly create. He had already made his decision, and nothing was going to change that. Sophia, on the other hand, was still in denial. She tried to reach out to him multiple times, leaving voicemails, sending texts, and even showing up at his apartment, but David didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had made it clear that he was done, and no amount of pleading was going to change his mind. As the divorce proceeded, David began to feel a sense of relief. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. He had spent years trying to make things work with someone who didn't respect him, and now he was reclaiming his life. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but David was ready for it. He had come to terms with the fact that it wasn't just Sophia he was leaving behind. It was the version of himself that had allowed her to dictate his life. He was moving forward, and this time he was doing it for himself. David sat across from Sophia, the air between them thick with unresolved tension. Every inch of his body screamed at him to walk out, to leave this house, this marriage, and never look back. But the truth was, he had nowhere else to go. Not yet. The hurt was still raw, and the betrayal cut deeper with every passing moment. But as he looked at Sophia sitting there, her eyes still darting away from his, he realized that the woman he once loved had already left long before the first lie was spoken. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. So, what now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia looked at him, her face a mixture of defiance and fear. What do you mean, what now? You already know what you're doing. You've made up your mind, haven't you? Her voice was colder now, more distant than before. David clenched his fists, feeling the anger build up inside him once again, but he kept his voice steady. I'm done, Sophia. I can't keep doing this. I can't pretend anymore. Sophia's expression remained unreadable, but her jaw tightened. She finally spoke, her tone dripping with sarcasm. So, that's it? You're just going to walk away like it's nothing? Like it's nothing? David repeated, his eyes narrowing. Sophia, you lied to me for months. You let me believe Caleb was mine, and for what? So you could continue playing house with a man who doesn't even care about you. You threw everything we built away for a lie. Sophia's eyes flickered with something, guilt, maybe, or the tiniest hint of regret, but she quickly masked it with anger. You're blowing this way out of proportion, David, she spat. It was one mistake, one night before we were even married. It doesn't change anything. We have a life together now, a family. Are you really going to throw all that away? David's heart twisted in his chest. He had heard these words before, but they no longer held any weight. He had given everything to her, his time, his love, his trust, and she had torn it all apart without a second thought. You're right, he said, his voice suddenly calm, too calm. It doesn't change anything. We're already done. Sophia's eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. She simply looked at him, the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. But David wasn't moved this time. He had already grieved for the woman he thought he knew. David stood up, grabbing the divorce papers from the table and sliding them across to her. I'm done, Sophia. I've already spoken to my lawyer. It's over. She stared at the papers, her hands trembling as she reached out to take them. You can't just do this, David. Her voice cracked, but there was no sincerity in it. It wasn't the plea of someone who realized the gravity of their actions. It was the panic of someone who had just lost control. David walked to the door without looking back. I don't need to do anything anymore. You already did it for me. The house that had once been a home felt empty now. He left without a single glance, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence that followed. He needed time to think, time to process everything that had just happened, but he wasn't sure where he was headed. All he knew was that he couldn't stay in the house with her any longer. He couldn't live in the same space with the woman who had destroyed everything. The next few days were a blur. David spent his time at a hotel, unsure of what to do next. His mind was racing, replaying every moment with Sophia, every lie she had told, every piece of trust that had been shattered. He had hoped that their marriage could be saved, but that was before he saw the truth, before he uncovered the lies that had been festering between them. Now, he could barely stand the thought of being around her. Sophia, on the other hand, had completely shifted into damage control mode. She began reaching out to mutual friends, trying to paint herself as the victim, the misunderstood wife who had made a mistake but was now trying to make things right. David could see right through her facade. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry that her lies had finally caught up with her. When David finally returned to the house, it wasn't to reconcile. It was to take what was his and make sure that everything was settled. The house was now just a house, no longer a symbol of their life together. It was where the lies had started, and it was where they would end. David had a plan now. He wasn't just walking away. He was making sure that he was legally protected, that he would never have to deal with Sophia's manipulation again. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, but Sophia wasn't going down without a fight. She hired a team of lawyers, and things got ugly fast. They battled over the house, the finances, and most of all, custody of Caleb. The reality of the situation began to sink in for David. He wasn't just losing a wife, he was losing the life he had built for himself. He had believed in something that wasn't real, and now he was paying the price. The hardest part for him, however, was seeing how Sophia played the part of the innocent victim. Her tears, her fake apologies, her insistence that she had done nothing wrong. It was all part of her act. She wanted everyone to believe that she was the woman wronged, not the one who had destroyed everything. It sickened David to watch it unfold, but he wasn't going to let her manipulate him again. As the legal proceedings wore on, David started to feel the weight of everything on his shoulders. But he wasn't going to back down. He had been betrayed, lied to, and taken for granted for far too long. He wasn't going to let Sophia get away with it, not anymore. Days passed in a blur for David. He moved into a temporary apartment, a small space that felt both foreign and oddly liberating. No longer was he surrounded by the ghost of his old life with Sophia. No more fake smiles or pretending everything was okay. For the first time in years, he was alone, and in the silence he found a strange sense of peace. But peace came with its own challenges. The apartment was cold, with only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside to keep him company. The weight of the divorce, the lies, and the deceit that had stained his marriage still lingered in his chest. But he knew one thing for sure now. He was done with the drama, done with trying to make something work that was broken beyond repair. He tried to focus on work, diving into projects with the kind of intensity he hadn't felt in months. But even in the midst of his work, thoughts of Caleb haunted him. It wasn't the child's fault. He was just a baby caught in the middle of two people who had no idea what they were doing anymore. But David couldn't shake the feeling that everything had been a lie. Sophia, on the other hand, didn't seem to have the same guilt weighing on her. She had moved on to the next stage of her life quickly. Friends and family were all on her side, telling David that it was just a phase for her, a moment of weakness that she was now over. But David could see through it. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't broken. She was still playing the game, trying to manipulate her way out of the mess she had created. Weeks went by, and the divorce proceedings moved at a snail's pace. Every time David thought things were finally moving forward, Sophia threw another wrench into the gears. She fought him over the assets, over Caleb, over everything. Her lawyer, a smooth-talking manipulator, tried every trick in the book to wear David down. But David was resolute. He wouldn't let her win, not after everything. The final straw came when Sophia attempted to convince the court that David should still be responsible for Caleb's future despite the child not being his. "You've been the father to this child," her lawyer argued. "You've lived with him for months, and it's in the child's best interest to keep a stable environment. David Harlow should be financially responsible for Caleb, no matter the circumstances." David's lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Vanessa, had been tirelessly defending his rights. She was everything David needed at that point, tough, no-nonsense, and determined to make sure Sophia's manipulation didn't succeed. "You've been deceived, Mr. Harlow," Vanessa said calmly as she reviewed the documents. "There is no legal obligation for you to pay for a child that is not yours, no matter the emotional ties. We will fight this to the end." The battle wasn't just about money, it was about respect. It was about showing Sophia that she couldn't just walk away from the wreckage she had caused, taking everything with her and leaving David to pick up the pieces. He had given her a chance to make things right, to own up to her mistakes, but she had refused. Instead, she kept pushing, playing the victim while David was left to face the consequences of her lies. As the court date approached, David prepared for what would likely be the final confrontation. He had all the evidence he needed now, including the paternity test results that had exposed Sophia's betrayal. The final ruling would come soon, and David was determined to walk away from this broken marriage with his head held high, no matter how difficult the journey had been. The day of the court hearing arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. David had been through enough emotional turmoil in the last few months to fill a lifetime, and today, he was going to finally see justice. He had no illusions about what this would mean, but he was ready to face whatever came. The last few weeks had been spent in preparation, gathering the necessary evidence, talking to his lawyer, Vanessa, and mentally preparing for a fight that would shape the rest of his life. David walked into the courtroom with his lawyer by his side, his mind sharp and focused. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He just wanted the truth to be heard and the lies to be exposed. When he stepped into the courtroom, the first thing he noticed was the look on Sophia's face: confusion, frustration, and perhaps a bit of fear. She wasn't the confident, calm woman he once knew. No, today she was a woman on the defensive, facing the consequences of her actions. Sophia was sitting next to her attorney, who was speaking in low tones, trying to reassure her. David could feel the unease radiating from her. The facade she had so carefully built over the years was starting to crack. The attorney sitting next to her looked as though he was just about ready to call it quits, but they had no choice but to continue. As David sat down, his mind wandered back to the past, the endless nights he'd spent wondering whether Sophia was really the woman he thought she was. The days when she had been his entire world. He recalled the early days of their marriage, the passion, the shared dreams, the promises. But those memories now felt like lies, illusions created to keep him tethered to a woman who never truly cared. The courtroom was quiet except for the soft murmur of lawyers exchanging information and the clinking of the judge's gavel. The air felt thick, and David could taste the bitterness of the lies that had been spoken. As the judge walked in and everyone stood, David glanced at the papers in front of him, the paternity test results, the financial records, the emails, and the text messages, all the pieces of evidence that proved Sophia's deceit. The judge called the proceedings to order, and the room fell silent. Vanessa stood up first and addressed the court, her voice firm and clear. Your Honor, we are here today because my client, Mr. David Harlow, has been deceived by the defendant, Mrs. Sophia Harlow. The defendant has not only lied about the paternity of her child, but has also tried to manipulate Mr. Harlow into believing that he was the father of a child that was never his. Our evidence, including a paternity test and several other documents, proves that the child in question is not Mr. Harlow's biological child. This is not just a case of infidelity. It is a case of betrayal on the highest level. Sophia's attorney stood up, interrupting Vanessa's statement. Objection, Your Honor, he said. This is an attempt to defame my client. We are here to discuss the custody of the child, not to bring up personal matters. The test results are irrelevant at this stage. The judge looked at both attorneys, his expression hardening. Sustained, he said. We are here today to focus on the legal matters at hand. However, I expect both parties to respect the integrity of the court proceedings. Let's move on. David sat in silence as the arguments unfolded, trying to keep his emotions in check. The courtroom drama had a surreal quality to it. As the hearing went on, David couldn't help but think about the many nights he had spent alone, wondering if he would ever find the truth. Now, sitting in this room with the truth laid bare for everyone to see, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. His thoughts were interrupted when Sophia stood up. Your Honor, I just want to say that I never intended for any of this to happen, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I made a mistake, yes, but it was a long time ago. I was confused, and I thought things would work themselves out. I never wanted to hurt David. I never wanted to break up our family. David's jaw clenched. The words were familiar, and yet they felt hollow. He had heard them all before. She was trying to paint herself as the victim, once again manipulating the situation to her advantage. But this time, it wasn't going to work. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. He wasn't the same man who had once believed her every word. The judge raised his hand, signaling for the room to quiet down. I think we've heard enough for today, he said. I will review all the evidence and make a ruling. This court is adjourned. As the proceedings wrapped up, David walked out of the courtroom feeling a mixture of relief and anger. He was done with the lies. He was done with the woman he had once called his wife. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the future he deserved. A future without the shadow of Sophia's betrayal hanging over him. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. David went through the motions, meeting with his lawyer, dealing with the aftermath of the court hearing, and preparing for what came next. He didn't want to think about Sophia anymore, but it was hard to ignore her attempts to manipulate him. She started sending him texts, trying to guilt him into reconsidering the divorce. We can work through this, she would say. For Caleb's sake, we can still fix this. David didn't reply. He had already made up his mind. There was no going back. As the weeks passed, the court finally made its ruling. The judge ruled in David's favor. Sophia had no legal grounds to demand financial support for Caleb, and the custody arrangements were set in place. David had won the battle. but the war had taken its toll. The emotional scars from the past few months wouldn't be healed overnight. But as David drove to his new apartment, he felt a sense of finality. The chapter with Sophia had ended. It was time for him to focus on rebuilding his life, on finding peace. He had learned some painful lessons, but he was determined to move forward. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was done being controlled by someone else's lies. The divorce was finalized, and with it, the last remnants of the life he had once known. But David wasn't looking back anymore. He was looking ahead, and as he stepped into his new life, he could finally breathe freely. The weeks following the court hearing were a blur for David. The chaos of the divorce proceedings seemed to intensify with every passing day. As much as he tried to focus on his work and new life, the sting of betrayal was still fresh in his mind. Every time he passed by the house that had once felt like a home, the anger and the sadness crept back up on him. He couldn't seem to shake the feeling of being lied to, manipulated, and betrayed by someone he had trusted completely. Sophia, on the other hand, seemed to be moving on. From what David could gather, she was still playing the role of the perfect mother, posting photos of Caleb, her happy family on social media. But every post, every smile felt fake. It was as if she was trying to convince herself that everything was okay, even though deep down, David knew it wasn't. There was no going back now. They had both crossed a line, and now the consequences were unfolding. One evening, David received a call from his lawyer, Vanessa. The news was not unexpected, but it still shook him to his core. "David," Vanessa said, her voice tense, "there's been a new development. Sophia has hired a new lawyer, and they're pushing for full custody of Caleb. They're using the fact that you acted like a father during the pregnancy and birth as leverage." David felt his blood pressure spike. He had known this was coming. Sophia had always been entitled, and now she was using Caleb as a pawn to manipulate the system. "What does that mean for me?" David asked, his voice calm but with a hint of frustration. "It means that this is going to get messy. She's playing dirty and she's not going to give up without a fight." "You need to be prepared for anything," Vanessa replied. David sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had been expecting this moment, but it didn't make it any easier to swallow. The legal battle for custody of Caleb was now inevitable, and David had to be ready for the fight of his life. His heart ached for Caleb, who was caught in the middle of this mess, but David knew he couldn't back down. He couldn't let Sophia win, not after everything she had done. As the days passed, David began to prepare for what was to come. He spent hours with Vanessa, going over the legal documents, strategizing and preparing for the upcoming court battles. The thought of seeing Sophia in court again, after everything that had happened, made his stomach turn, but he wasn't going to let her manipulate him anymore. He had been deceived for too long, and now it was time to take control of his life and fight for what was right. The next court date loomed closer. David felt like he was carrying a weight on his shoulders, the pressure mounting with every passing day. The nights were the hardest. He couldn't stop thinking about Caleb, about how this innocent child had been dragged into the middle of all of this. Caleb deserved better than this. He deserved a father who would always have his back, who would never lie to him, who would never betray him. But that was not the reality that David was facing. No, the reality was a courtroom where his every move would be scrutinized, where every word would be used against him. He had to be strategic. He had to be smart. Finally, the day arrived. David stood in front of the judge again, this time with more resolve than ever before. The courtroom felt different today. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that this would be the day that would change everything. Sophia was seated across from him, her posture stiff, her eyes filled with defiance. She had always been the one in control, but not today. Today, it was David's turn. The judge called the proceedings to order, and the room fell silent. David's lawyer, Vanessa, stood up first, presenting their case. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and firm, "we are here today to fight for the best interests of Caleb. While Mr. Harlow may not be Caleb's biological father, he has been a father figure to him for the past several months. He has cared for him, provided for him, and formed a bond with him that cannot be broken. It is in Caleb's best interest that he remain in the care of Mr. Harlow. Sophia's lawyer jumped in, immediately countering Vanessa's statement. Your Honor, while we acknowledge that Mr. Harlow has played a role in Caleb's life, we believe that the biological father should have the right to take on the responsibility of raising Caleb. We also have evidence that suggests Mr. Harlow is not emotionally stable and is using this legal battle to manipulate the situation. David's blood boiled. He knew that Sophia was behind all of this, trying to twist the facts to her advantage. But he remained calm, focused. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to let her tear him apart now. As the proceedings continued, it was clear that the battle for Caleb's custody was going to be fierce. Both sides presented their arguments, and David could feel the weight of every word. His heart ached as he listened to Sophia's lawyer speak, but he knew that he had to stay strong. He wasn't going to lose Caleb, not when he had fought so hard for him. The judge listened carefully to both sides, taking notes and asking questions. Finally, after what felt like hours, the judge spoke. I have heard enough, he said. The decision will be made after careful consideration of all the evidence presented. We will reconvene in 2 weeks to deliver the ruling. David left the courtroom feeling drained, but there was a sense of relief too. The fight wasn't over, but he had made it through. He had stood up for Caleb, for what was right, and he was determined to see this through to the end. 2 weeks later, the final ruling came down. The judge ruled in David's favor. Caleb would remain with him, and Sophia was granted only limited visitation rights. The judge also made it clear that Sophia's actions in manipulating the situation and hiding the truth had hurt her credibility in the court's eyes. David sat in his car after the ruling, the relief washing over him in waves. He had won. It had been a long, hard battle, but he had emerged victorious. Sophia's manipulation had not succeeded. He was Caleb's father, and nothing would change that. David's life began to return to some semblance of normal. He focused on raising Caleb, building their bond, and moving forward with his life. There were still scars from the past, but he was healing. Every day was a step forward, and with Caleb by his side, David knew that he had everything he needed. The days following the court's decision were a strange mix of relief and regret. David had won, and that fact should have brought him comfort. But as he lay in his new apartment, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was now divided into 2 parts, before and after the divorce. He had left the house he had shared with Sophia, the place that once felt like a home, and now he was starting over, rebuilding from the ground up. Sophia had been granted only limited visitation rights, and David had full custody of Caleb. The court had seen through the lies, through the manipulation, and had ruled in favor of the truth. But the cost of winning had been high. The legal battle had drained him emotionally and financially, and now, even though he had custody of Caleb, he couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had happened. He had always hoped that things would work out for the better. He had believed that his marriage, despite its struggles, was worth saving. But Sophia's lies, her betrayal, had shattered that hope beyond repair. Still, Caleb was now in his care. The boy had been a pawn in this whole mess, and David was determined to be the father he deserved. Every morning, David would wake up early to make Caleb breakfast, help him with his schoolwork, and tuck him in at night. He was doing his best, but it was hard to ignore the deep hole that had formed in his heart. Being a father to Caleb felt like an honor, but it also reminded him of all that had been lost. The relationship that he had once envisioned with Sophia was now a distant memory. And every time he looked at Caleb, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been taken from him, something he couldn't get back. Despite this, David knew that he had to move forward. He couldn't change the past, and dwelling on it would only make things worse. But moving forward wasn't as easy as it sounded. Every time he saw Sophia's name pop up on his phone or heard about her social media posts, a surge of anger would rise in him. It wasn't just the lies or the betrayal. It was the fact that she seemed to think she could continue with her life without any consequences. One evening, after putting Caleb to bed, David found himself scrolling through social media. He had tried to stay away from it, but tonight he felt compelled to look. And there it was. A post from Sophia, a photo of her smiling with Caleb as if nothing had happened, as if everything was fine. The picture was taken at a park, with Caleb on her lap, looking up at the camera with innocent eyes. David could barely look at it. The lies were still there, lurking behind the smile on her face. The picture made David's blood boil. He didn't care about her moving on, but this felt like a slap in the face. She was pretending to be the perfect mother, the one who had everything together, when in reality, she had lied and cheated. David knew he had to let go of this anger. He couldn't keep carrying it around. He couldn't let her win by keeping him stuck in the past. But it was hard, harder than he had ever imagined. The next day, David received an unexpected message. It was from an old friend, Matt, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Matt had always been the life of the party, the guy who was always up for an adventure. The message was simple. "Hey man, I heard about everything that's been going on. If you ever need to talk or get away, I've got a place upstate. Come by whenever." David stared at the message for a while, unsure of what to do. He had always been a bit of a loner since the divorce, preferring the quiet of his apartment to the socializing he once enjoyed. But something about Matt's message struck a chord. Maybe it was the idea of getting away from it all, of finding a moment of peace. Maybe it was the idea of reconnecting with someone who didn't know the pain and betrayal he had been through. Whatever it was, David found himself replying, "I think I could use a change of scenery. I'll take you up on that offer." A few days later, David packed his bags and headed upstate. The drive was long, but as the city skyline faded behind him, he felt a sense of relief. The further he drove, the lighter he felt. When he arrived at Matt's cabin, it felt like stepping into a different world. The air was fresher, the pace slower. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, and for the first time in a long while, David felt a sense of calm wash over him. Matt was waiting for him when he arrived, a grin on his face. "Welcome to the escape, my friend," Matt said, pulling David into a hug. "Let's get you settled, and then we can grab a drink. You deserve it." The next few days were a blur of hikes, late-night talks, and quiet moments of reflection. Matt was a good friend, and for the first time since the divorce, David felt like he could breathe. There was no pressure, no expectations, just a chance to clear his mind. But even in the calmness of Matt's cabin, the question still lingered. What would life be like after everything had changed? Could he truly move on from Sophia, from the lies, from the pain? Every time he looked at Caleb, he saw hope, but he also saw the ghost of what had been lost. By the time David returned to the city, he felt more at peace than he had in months. The trip had given him the clarity he needed. He was ready to fight for what was best for Caleb and to start fresh, to build a life that didn't involve Sophia or the mistakes of the past. The future wasn't clear, but David knew one thing for sure. He was done being the victim. He was done letting Sophia's actions define him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, David felt ready to take it. He was determined to give Caleb the best future possible, and he was ready to leave behind the hurt, the betrayal, and the uncertainty. It was time for a new beginning. As the weeks passed, David found himself settling into his new routine. The days were no longer filled with the constant anxiety and tension that had plagued him during the final years of his marriage. Caleb was doing well, and for the first time in a long time, David could feel a sense of calm settling over him. The anger and frustration that had once consumed him were fading, replaced by a quiet determination to move forward. He was learning how to live again, how to rebuild himself, piece by piece, without the constant shadow of Sophia's lies hanging over him. But despite all this progress, the road ahead wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when doubt would creep in, when Caleb would ask questions about Sophia, or when David would see a photo of her online, smiling, acting like everything was fine. It was in those moments that the anger would return, but it was fleeting. He had made a choice to move on, to let go of the pain. He just had to remind himself of that every time he was tempted to revisit the past. One Saturday afternoon, David was sitting in his living room sipping on a cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. As he opened the door, he was surprised to see Sophia standing on his doorstep, holding Caleb in her arms. Her face looked worn, tired, as if the last few months had taken their toll on her. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice shaky, as if she wasn't sure if she should even be there. David stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure of what to do. He hadn't seen her in weeks, not since the divorce was finalized. He had no intention of ever letting her back into his life. But seeing her standing there, vulnerable, with Caleb clinging to her, tugged at something deep inside him. "I didn't think you'd want to talk to me," David said, his voice colder than he intended. "What do you want?" "I know you're angry, David," she said, her voice breaking, "but I need you to hear me out. I've made a mess of everything, and I don't know how to fix it, but I want to try." For Caleb's sake, David took a deep breath, the familiar pain in his chest threatening to resurface. He looked down at Caleb, who was staring up at him with big, innocent eyes. The child didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of all this. He was the one innocent party in the whole mess. "Caleb doesn't deserve any of this," David said quietly, stepping aside to let Sophia in. "But that doesn't mean I'm going to let you manipulate me again. You've lied to me over and over, and now you want to come back into my life because it's convenient for you?" Sophia's eyes welled up with tears as she looked at him. "I know I've hurt you, David, but I've changed. I realize now how wrong I was. Please, just give me a chance to prove it. I'm not asking you to forgive me, but for Caleb's sake, let's try to work something out. Let's find a way to make this right." David wanted to scream at her, wanted to tell her how much pain she had caused, how much she had ruined everything. But he knew that would get him nowhere. He had to be smart about this. He had to stay strong. "You've done enough damage," he said, his voice firm. "I don't owe you anything, Sophia. You don't get to come back into my life and expect me to just forget everything that happened. I'm not that guy anymore." She looked at him, her face crumpling in sorrow. "I'm sorry, David. I'm so sorry for everything." David didn't respond. He simply nodded and turned away, walking to the kitchen. He didn't want to see her anymore, didn't want to hear her apologies. He had heard them all before, and they meant nothing now. He couldn't go back to the way things were. His life was better without her. He had moved on, and he wasn't going to let her take that away from him. Sophia left shortly after, taking Caleb with her. As David watched them walk out the door, he felt a strange sense of finality. The past was over. It was done, and while he would always care for Caleb, he had no desire to get dragged back into Sophia's mess. She was no longer his problem. In the weeks that followed, David focused on building a new life for himself. He continued his work, started making new friends, and slowly but surely, he began to feel like himself again. The healing process wasn't easy, but it was worth it. He was no longer living in the shadow of his past, and he was finally learning to live for himself. One day, as David was out for a run, he got a call from his lawyer. "David," the lawyer said, "I have good news. Sophia has signed the final divorce papers. The financial settlement is complete, and you're officially free." For the first time in months, David felt a sense of true relief. It was over. It was finally over.